Bodybuilding is a competitive sport where a combination of muscle size, symmetry, leanness, and stage presentation are judged. This video is about peak week recommendations for bodybuilders, and I'm sitting down with the one and only Guillermo Escalante, which was the principal author of this latest paper. He and his colleagues, including Chris Barkat, Alan Aragon, Brad Schoenfeld, and Scott Stevenson, critically reviewed this current literature to try to understand more about peaking protocols and provided evidence-based recommendations and effective strategies on peaking. So we discussed a little bit about how lean should you be before considering getting in contest prep. What does peak week mean? Should we manipulate something like supplements, pre-workout, stimulants, creatine, vitamins, minerals, protein, carbs? What needs to be manipulated? Fiber, fodmaps. What do you need to do with that? How do you manipulate training, cardio, NEAT? All of that and more. We delve very deep into those topics. Finally, to summarize the few practical applications for peak week for nutrition and training. I hope you enjoy and just find this episode beneficial and helpful. Please like, consider subscribing to the channel, share with a friend. I'll see you on the other side. And I am really excited to jump on everything you've done in this recent paper you published on peak week. And I think it was so exciting to see this research and this information. And you were one of the leading authors of the paper. So why that paper in the first place? What inspired you to kind of get into that particular topic on peak week and do that systematic review?
Yeah, it was one of those that I was actually on a podcast a little more than a year ago, and the person that was doing the podcast was asking some questions related to bodybuilding and why do they carb load? Why do they manipulate water? What about sodium? And as I was answering a lot of the questions, it really got my mind thinking. I said, there's not a lot of scientific evidence. In fact, there's nothing written in the scientific community with regards to peak week and the things that are done in peak week and all of the things that are practiced, what's commonly done. And realistically, as a bodybuilding competitor, there's no resources of where to go to. A lot of it is just hearsay. So you have coaches from all over the place telling you to do this or do that. But, some of them do know what they're doing. There's a lot of them, but there's a lot of them that don't know what they're doing. And they don't necessarily base their information on science and basic physiological principles. So I decided to come up with a team of really talented individuals. So I was able to recruit Chris Barkat and Scott Stevenson, of course, Brad Schoenfeld and Alan Aragon. And, I had kind of a preliminary outline, but then we got our brains together and we started putting more things to paper. And then the paper just started evolving and evolving. So it took us about 6 solid months to actually write it between all of us. And we spent some time, of course, doing the research, finding the information, and we split it up into different sections, but we all contributed to each other's sections. So it was really fun experience. And then it just finally came out last month. So, but that's really what inspired me to write it.
Oh my God, this is so awesome. And it is incredible that it actually came from a podcast. You never know how many questions you get in a podcast or these interviews that actually get you thinking, oh my God, I don't really have a solid answer, but and that just led you straight away to think about getting more research and more like firm-based evidence to talk about it.
Absolutely.
I read your paper and look, it is so full of information, and it sort of debunks so many myths that are around the manipulation of certain strategies like manipulation of carbohydrates, water, sodium, supplements, sleep, training, all of these things. So I want to delve right into it. But before that, I wanted to ask you how lean should you be before considering getting into contest prep? It's like a cutoff body fat or leanness, or like if you're way too high in body fats, you probably don't even think about it.
Yeah, I think that's really a great question. it's one of those things where, what are you trying to accomplish is when I work with a client, what are they trying to accomplish? And occasionally you see some people that have, maybe they were extremely obese and overweight, and, they've lost 150 pounds, and all of a sudden, they just want to show what they have, and they just want to say that they placed, and they just don't want to look ridiculous in front of everybody. But, maybe they don't necessarily want to be, the winner. They just want to say, it's like, I competed, it was a body transformation. So that's that level of competitor with that mentality. And then there's the other competitor who's now, no, they're serious. They want to win. They want to go to the national level. They want to win a pro card. They want to maybe go to the Olympia. So that level of competitor, obviously, it's a different type of mindset, different type of strategies that you're going to have to follow. But that being said, it's a great question, because one thing that we highlighted in the paper is, this peak week stuff. A lot of people put a lot of emphasis on it. Now, it's important, but it's not as important as the question that you're gearing. In other words, what did you do those previous 16, 20, 24 weeks to actually get ready for this competition? And if your body fat if you're not lean enough, nothing that you do in the last week is going to save you. And this is the problem that I see. Even sometimes judges' feedback is, you were holding too much water is a very, very frequent words that are used to the competitors. But really what they mean is they're holding too much fat, which makes them look soft and not defined. So water is not the problem. The fact is that they need to lose an extra 5, 10, 12 pounds of body fat to really be successful. So that's a long answer to your question. So if you want to be really competitive, I would say, yes, you definitely have to be lean enough. What that means, I think it depends on what category you're competing. If you're a female bikini competitor, it's a little bit different than if you're a male traditional classic bodybuilder, because the classic bodybuilder needs to have striated glutes, striations in their deltoids, striations in their lower back. So that level of leanness for most competitors is going to be, low single digit body fat. Usually I say it's a range, because I've seen some competitors that carry body fat. They distribute their body fat so well that at about 6 or 7% body fat, they have striations in their glutes. Or you have people like me, I have to get down to well under the single digit body fat level. And I'm gonna say around 5-ish, 4-ish, 3-ish, right in there before I really can kind of see it. Of course, when we're getting to that lean of body fat, what is your body fat really? There's some calculation errors in that. So that's why I say 3 to 5-ish, depending on what I'm getting measured. I've used a DEXA. The leanest I've ever measured on a DEXA was 4.4% on a DEXA, but of course there's some measurement error there. And at that level, I did have striations in my glutes. So that kind of gives me that ballpark figure. But some competitors legitimately, maybe they've gotten a DEXA and they're maybe 6.5%, and they look phenomenal. So that kind of gives you a range for males. Females can usually have a little bit more body fat. I would say most female bodybuilders maybe around 7 to 9, 8 to 10, somewhere around there. Bikini competitors maybe can get away with having a little bit more body fat. And once they get to the extremely lean levels, they usually get points taken off because they're actually too hard, too lean.
So when you say that, is that number that you're referring to, that body fat percentage, is just when they are just about to compete, or before they actually decide to prep?
Yeah, that would be right when they're going to step on stage. So after they've gone through the process for doing it, and I'll use myself as a personal example. So in my off season, I like to stay between about 12, 14% at the heaviest. Occasionally I may go a little bit higher, 16, 17. I don't like to be that high, but if I'm splurging a lot and having a little too much fun, that can happen. And then I have to kind of get down to that level. So usually for me, I need a minimum of 16 weeks to get into contest shape, but I actually prefer to do 20 to 24 weeks to really kind of land me there, because I actually prefer to be ready about 3 to 4 weeks before my contest. And the times that I've looked my best, that's usually the case. About 4 weeks before the show, I'm pretty much ready to step on stage. And now I'm just fine tuning my physique, but I'm really not trying to diet necessarily more or push my calories lower or do more cardio. I'm usually kind of maybe even eating a little bit more to just actually enhance my look a little bit at that point.
Yeah, it seems like it is kind of the ideal scenario that you're ready beforehand, so you can do a little bit of a reverse, starting your reverse, even leading to the show. So you're already fuller, you have more energy, you're training better, you don't look like you're a walking dead or something like that. So going into like peak week, I know probably for those who are in this industry, it's easy to know what that means. But probably a lot of people that hear that word, it is not really clear what it means. So what does peak week mean, and how does this special week maximizes contest day aesthetics?
Yeah, so peak week is the traditional term used by competitors in bodybuilding. That is those last, what are you doing those last 7 to 10 days before you step on stage? So traditionally, shows usually take place on, usually a Saturday is the main day for most events. And so if you're going to compete on this Saturday over here, what are you doing 7 to 10 days before, leading up to the show? So that peak week is that week before, leading into your Saturday competition. And again, the unfortunate part is a lot of beginners and even some advanced competitors, they think that miracles will happen in that 7-day window. But the reality is if you're not ready, no miracle will happen in that last 7 days. So yes, it's important, but it's only going to be effective. Peak week's really only effective if your body fat is low enough and you're in condition enough to actually have it make a difference. So if you're a male bodybuilder, for example, and you're at 10% body fat right at peak week, it's not going to do anything for you. You're going to be very disappointed, and it's not going to make the placing. Now, if you're in that low single-digit body fat and you can manipulate some of these variables, you can actually notice appreciable changes in your body significantly. That actually may affect the outcome. Also saying that is, sometimes it's better not to even do anything if it's your first time, if you can't practice it, if you've never done it, because sometimes the risk to benefit, the risk to reward ratio can be not good in your favor if you don't know what you're doing, if you're manipulating too many things. So sometimes it's just better to leave all the variables alone, or maybe only manipulate one variable as opposed to all 5, 6, 7 variables, because sometimes disaster can take place. And so unless you can practice it, or you have some experience, or have an experienced coach that knows what they're doing, I personally would not try to mess with all the variables at once, because you're throwing too many things up in the air, which could lead to disaster.
Yeah, it can be very, I don't know, overwhelming especially when you see every single variable that you can manipulate to make sure you're looking very, very, very neat, dry, and like really good for the show. But now I had two follow-up questions from something you mentioned. You've mentioned a few times divisions, and I know there are different divisions for the shows and the bodybuilding contest prep, just because depending on what division you decide to go into, your prep might look a little bit different, and your readiness just before the show, it might be as well a little bit different, as well as perhaps the training and the development of certain areas of your body. So what are some of these divisions, or like if you can run through what are these divisions and how do you, what is the difference between them? Why ones are a little bit more stricter and place a lot of emphasis on like very dry physique, and others a little bit more relaxed, like fitness? They just looking for an overall image. So tell me a little bit about those divisions.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And again, a lot of these divisions are actually fairly new, meaning over the last 15 years. When I competed in bodybuilding in the year 2000, there were very limited divisions altogether. So for men, if you wanted to compete, there was only bodybuilding. There was no other. There were weight classes, but there was no men's physique, no classic physique. There was none of that. For women, there was only fitness, and they do the fitness routine basically like a floor routine. And then back then they had a 1-piece and a 2-piece suit. They're evaluating them on their physique. And then they had bodybuilding for women. That was it. So those were the only 3 divisions, even as much as 20 years ago. Then a few years went by, and some of these other divisions started developing. I think promoters were smart, because some people maybe didn't want to look like a bodybuilder. Some women didn't want to look like a female bodybuilder, or maybe they didn't have the gymnastics, cheerleading background to do a floor routine for the females. So to be able to bring more competitors to the shows and get more interest in people, they developed different divisions. So the first one was the men's physique division, which is basically the board shorts. So initially, when they first started, a lot of these guys look more like I'm gonna call them like a beach fitness model. Wearing board shorts. Legs were underemphasized. They didn't care what legs, they were covered anyway. You could see your calves, that's about it. But your quads, your hamstrings, your glutes, can't see that with the board shorts. So that doesn't really get judged. Upper body, they wanted obviously a nice V taper, nice abs, broader shoulders. Leanness was important and symmetry is important, sure. Then over time, though, those guys started becoming bigger and bigger. So some of the physique, the world class physique men of today are actually they are bodybuilders. They're not as big as the traditional classic bodybuilders, but they're fairly muscular and they have a good amount of muscularity. A lot of them, even in their legs, have a lot of muscularity in their legs. So it's kind of evolved. Then somewhere along the line, they developed the men's classic physique, and that came about around 14, 15, which now instead of emphasizing the overall muscularity of the traditional male bodybuilders, they put a height and weight ratio of how tall and how much muscle, how much weight you can carry. So for example, I'm about 5'5". So at 5'5", you can only weigh, I think, 170 pounds in the NPC. So therefore, because it tops out at a certain weight class, if you're only this tall, you can only weigh this much. So therefore, you can only get so big. Then they do the bodybuilding poses, but they do a lot of what are called the classic physique poses back from the golden era of bodybuilding in the 1960s and 70s, where they have more, it's more artistic, I'm going to say, in how they pose. They don't reward excessive muscularity. They reward size, but not to the point where they're going to give the mass sponsor, because there really are no mass sponsors because there's a cap in how much you can weigh. And then they're rewarding, of course, symmetry and everything else. Then in the women's side, you have all these other divisions. It started with figure. So there was fitness first and bodybuilding. Then figure came along, which was kind of a hybrid between the bodybuilding and they looked very similar to fitness, but they didn't do the floor routine. And back then they did 1-piece and 2-piece suits, and these suits were expensive. I remember my ex-wife was a pro figure competitor who competed in the Olympia, but the first 1-piece that we bought for her, it was like $1,500 for one bathing suit. And I couldn't believe it. This was in 2006 or 7. And I mean, I couldn't believe we're spending that kind of money on a bathing suit, essentially, but they were very expensive. I need to buy 2 of them, one piece and a 2-piece. They did away with that a little bit later. So they were, again, muscular, but not overly developed. Those women nowadays have also become a little bit more muscular. Then they threw in the women's physique division, which is a little bit more muscular than the figure, but a little bit less muscular than the bodybuilders. They added that division in there. They actually did away with women's bodybuilding for a while, but now it's back. And then lastly, they added the women's bikini division, which again, they're looking for athletic women, but they're not rewarding excessive muscularity. They usually want nice glutes, rounded delts, nice V taper, small waistline, good presentation, overall sex appeal and sexiness. They want that component of it. But they're not rewarding excessive muscularity or excessive separation and hardness in those divisions. Yeah, so there's a lot that goes into all of these divisions and what they're looking for.
That's awesome. I am wondering if you have to look certain way or have certain body shape to kind of be thinking about which division can I sort of jump into. Because like if you mentioned like there's one division that you said that you are this height and you have just to think about you can't be this big or just like a weight class limitation there. But like someone who seems to be very like more how do you say slim and like longer, perhaps they fit into a better division than perhaps figure, and figure maybe you can be a little bit more shorter and more muscular from the very beginning to kind of say, well, I don't want to get that lean or that skinny, but I can go and just get bigger and because of where I am studying, and I could just go and do figure or something like that. So is your body shape or your body structure a good way to think or decide which division might suit you best?
I think it's a good way to kind of look at it. But one of the beauties about our sport of bodybuilding is that's kind of the challenge, is to kind of etch your body and make it something that it wasn't. So and there's a lot of competitors out there that if you would have seen them when they started bodybuilding, you would have never thought they would have gotten to the level that they are. Now, the other answer to this question is depends. How much time do you have? How much time do you want to invest? What risk are you willing to take? Because obviously there may be some pharmacological interventions, time investment into all of this. So I'll give you an example. Sean Claridia, who's the 212 Olympia champion. The guy's a little guy. He's like 5'2" maybe. And on stage, he only weighs like 175 pounds or something. So he's not a very big man, but he beat out guys in the 212 division that were 212 pounds that were squeezing down into it. But when Sean started bodybuilding, if you look at his pictures from 2005, 2006, and even in high school, he was a 95-pound kid. So he was built tiny, like a rail, really. He was a wrestler, so he was lanky. Of course, it's taken him, nearly 20 years to put on this level of muscularity, but he's added 60 pounds to his 5'2" frame. And now, even though he only weighs 175 pounds, and I'm just throwing that number out there, he looks immense and he looks huge then compared to some of these guys that are over 200 pounds. So it just took him a long time to get there. But definitely, and if you looked at him at first, you might have think maybe you should go into men's physique because you can't get that big. But the fact is he can get that big. It just took him a lot of time, dedication, effort, time in the gym, and commitment to doing it. Before I forget, I forgot one more division in women, and that's women's wellness, which is a relatively new division. It's been around in Europe and other parts of the world, but in the US, fairly new division, which again, it's a little bit softer, similar to the women's figure, but they're usually a little bit more curvy and just slightly soft on the softer side as compared to the figure competitors. I didn't want to forget that. I just remembered that.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the question, for the answer to that question with your body type. I think it can help you if you're more mesomorphic, for example, and maybe you played professional American football and you've kind of developed that. It may not take you as long to do bodybuilding compared as if you were an endurance cross country runner or a marathon runner. It might take you a little longer, but you can still get there. It just takes a little bit. It takes more sacrifice, more work, more time.
Okay. And can you jump from one division to another? If you started on one, let's say I was studying in wellness, and then I decided to kind of get myself a little bit tougher, and I decided to go into physique or something like that.
Yeah, it really depends on the organization. In the IFBB, once you get your pro card, you can actually shift from division to division. So you could, for example, turn pro in bikini. And if you decide, like you said, maybe you decide I want to get more muscular as a female, you can compete in women's wellness, for example, 3 years later. So once you get your pro card, you can actually shift. In the amateur level through the National Physique Committee here in the USA, which is the feeder into the IFBB, same thing. You can cross over. It depends on the promoter and the certain rules. So certain shows will let you cross over into another division. So very often, for example, a men's classic physique competitor will also cross over into the men's open bodybuilding division, particularly in the smaller weight classes. So usually guys in my height category, for example, or just a little taller, if you're like a middleweight or below, it's usually fairly easy to go from a middleweight or welterweight bodybuilder into a men's classic physique division, because for your height and your weight, you're usually going to kind of hit that mark most of the time.
Okay. And is that something that you can do like within a year, for example, if there's different competitions, you can just jump from one to another, or is it within the same competition?
Yeah, sometimes they're done even within the same competition. So there are some shows where the same guy that wins the division in men's welterweight bodybuilding is the same guy that wins the men's classic physique A division. Okay. Usually it's bodybuilding and classic physique that kind of switch. You don't usually see the traditional physique and classic physique switch over, or traditional physique and men's bodybuilding. You don't usually see those guys switch over because usually the classic physique guys, at least at the amateur level, they're usually not as muscular. The pros are usually fairly muscular, but again, even compared to the other pros in those divisions, they're usually not as muscular as the bodybuilders, the regular physique guys. So they might not be able to do it.
Oh, okay. Understand now. Okay, let's get into the juicy part of the paper, which is the picking strategies. And let's talk about carb manipulation, water and sodium manipulation. How does these differ? Perhaps like coming from each division, is that something that is particularly different when it comes to each division with this peak week and how dry you look, or how much water and sodium you have to manipulate. You mentioned a little bit of that, but perhaps to kind of clarify specifically with these two particular strategies with carbohydrate and water and sodium manipulation.
Yeah, and it's a great question because when we were talking about writing this paper, we decided to call it specifically for bodybuilding because there are so many diverse divisions that the guidelines are already kind of very broad guidelines because you can't cookie cutter a contest prep, or you can't cookie cutter the peak week for each person. So we kind of painted some very broad guidelines so you can customize and individualize what's going to work for that individual. So one of the statements that we actually made in our paper is basically there are so many different divisions and judging criteria, and even within divisions, the judging criteria for one organization may be different than the judging criteria for another organization in the same division. So you really have to study, what organization you're going to be competing in and what are their judging criteria for that particular category. So as a coach or as an athlete, you want to make sure you investigate, what division you're going to compete in and what that organization's requirements and ideals are for winning that competition. What look are they looking for? So that being said, yeah, it's very different for each one because I'm going to kind of put the two extremes together. If I'm going to work with, let's say a person getting ready for the Olympia in men's bodybuilding, they need to be, as dry and full as possible to have the best chance of winning. Whereas now, if I'm working with a female bikini competitor, if I get them super dry and super full, they're going to lose because, the judges don't want to see glute striations in that individual. They don't want to see everything be, super tight and overly pumped. They don't want that look. They actually want a little bit of a softer look, some of these traditionally feminine traits is they actually want to see that in some of the females. So you really can't bring in that same level of conditioning with the two different athletes. So you would actually take a different approach with those individuals. And that's a common mistake that I think I see a lot of people do because you may see a bikini competitor competing and they may be having some issues backstage, maybe passing out, low blood pressure. And because I worked on the medical side of things, and that was often my number one person that I would usually have issues with would be the bikini competitors, and you figure why. And often when I questioned them, it was, what diuretic did you take, or when was the last time you drank water? And more often than not, their coach, quote unquote, is their boyfriend or their boyfriend's friend, who's a gigantic bodybuilder that recommended the same protocol that they did for this 115, 120 pound bikini competitor, which is not going to work, nor do they need to. But this is often one of the things that I would see up there is the advice that they got was just basically poor advice with wrong information and a lot of potentially dangerous information too.
So what are some of the key points or takeaways in terms of carb manipulation to kind of put it into practice, or what are some of the ways to reduce some mistakes that people make when it comes to sodium and water manipulation that can be a little bit risky for like in life, especially like if you cut too much water or too much sodium. So what are some of these tips or takeaways that you can kind of summarize from your paper that might be very useful and practical when it comes to these two strategies specifically?
Yeah, no, great. And I'm glad you asked both of those because when one variable affects the other. So water affects sodium, sodium affects water, water affects glycogen loading, carb loading affects water. So they're all really mixed. So you really have to be careful in how you do it, which is kind of adds the other point. If you're manipulating this one and manipulating that one and manipulating that one, and they're all interrelated, you can really have a recipe for disaster if you've never practiced it, if you've never done it. So kind of to avoid that, I'm gonna start with the carb loading first, because that's I would say that out of all of the strategies, that's probably the tried and truest one that it actually has the most amount of documentation in terms of what's been done. We actually cite several investigations where it's been looked at. Now, they're not high level investigations by any means, but at least we have some data to support and say, yeah, there seems to be some potential here. We kind of understand the mechanism, and the risk to benefit ratio seems to kind of weigh on the side more of the benefit instead of the risk. So it's relatively safe. So carb loading, typically we do a 3-day or so depletion state of lower carbohydrates with the goal to super compensate and be able to increase glycogen storage leading up to the show. And there's a few ways you can do the carb loading. You can front load them, you can back load them, or you could do the strategy that we recommend, which is kind of utilizing both, where you're kind of loading in the middle of the week and then kind of tapering off toward the end. So front loading means, as it says, you're basically, you're doing your depletion. If this is Saturday, you're going to be doing your loading maybe on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and then you're going to kind of hold into Saturday. So you're going to have to do your depletion maybe 10 days before. If you backload it, maybe you're depleting on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then you load on Thursday, Friday to compete on Saturday. That's the backloading version, which can work too. All of these can work. The reason we like the middle of the road one is because it gives us enough time to be able to manipulate. You can eat a little bit more. You can eat a little bit less if you need to. So if you overcorrect or undercorrect or overestimate or underestimate, you can make some adjustments during that time. So the way that we recommend it, and both Chris Farracat, Scott Stevenson, and I have used this with a lot of our competitors, is we actually deplete, let's say Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, with the competition on Saturday. We load on Wednesday, Thursday aggressively with carbohydrates. And then on Friday, we taper the carbohydrates a little bit. We go back to similar to what your diet was maybe on Monday, Tuesday, maybe with a little bit of extra carbs, depending on what your body's looking like. So you might go a little bit more aggressive on the carbs, or you might go actually fairly low carb like you were on your carb depletion days, depending on how that body is responding at that point in time. One mistake that I think people make with that bodybuilders make with the carb loading is a lot of bodybuilders manipulate the water and the salt at the same time. So one thing that they often do is they maybe carb load without drinking water. Well, that creates a problem because you actually need water in order to fill the muscle cell. So the muscle itself, you want to basically maximize the intracellular water in the muscle and minimize the extracellular water. Well, we know that if you're actually taking in the carbohydrates and you actually have the water available, your chances of increasing the intracellular water and having that muscle be full through the glycogen that's stored in the muscle is going to be beneficial. So you need the water to kind of shuttle in the carbohydrate into that. The other component is, and we actually have some, there's some data, again, there's some variance in this, but every gram of glycogen really brings in about anywhere between 2.7 to about 4 grams of water. And there's some variability in there. So 3 is kind of a good number. So every gram of carb is going to bring in, 3 grams of water in there. So it's important to understand that physiological principle as well. But you do need some water to get the glycogen loading in there. The other mistake that they make is maybe they usually drop their sodium at the same time that they're carb loading. And that could be problematic as well. Some of the reports that we see in the literature is a lot of the competitors report some gastrointestinal discomfort with the carb loading. Now, some of that may be because they're eating a lot more carbs than they're used to. Maybe they're eating a different carb, which we actually typically don't recommend. We don't recommend you eating new types of carbs that you haven't eaten for the last 16 weeks. We recommend you eating similar carbohydrates that you're used to metabolizing and taking in. But if you drop the sodium at the same time, we actually discussed the sodium-dependent glucose transporters, which play a role in being able to absorb the carbohydrate through the small intestine. And if you don't have the sodium in there, you may inhibit your ability to transport that, which could create potentially some discomfort in the gastrointestinal tract, which would make you bloated, make you feel gassy, make you feel blah. It's not a good feeling. And now you have a distended belly on top of that, which is not ideal for competing on stage. So I would say those are the 3 things. So do your carb loading. Midweek is when we recommend it. Do your depletion a few days beforehand. Start your loading. How much to load? It really depends on you. You have to play with that. Some people need a lot of carbohydrates, up to maybe 12 grams per kilogram of body weight. Some people maybe need only 4 grams per kilogram of body weight, and somewhere in between.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So you said that you use grams per kilogram. So is that based on net body weight or grams per kilogram of body or lean body mass? And second question is that in this particular period, like in this peak week, your calorie targets no longer are like that rigid. It's more based on your macros and like grams per kilogram of fats, carbs, and protein, and whatever that is looking for calories, that's what it is. Or like you're still aiming for a specific calorie target and then adjusting your macros based on that calorie target.
Great question. Yeah, we usually target it as just per body weight is usually the easiest way to go about it. And then of course you can just adjust that number up or down, because we do recommend, again, a trial week, at least 2 to 4 weeks out. So you can kind of test some of these variables out to see how your body's responding, you know, how many carbs do you need, et cetera. So I always recommend having a little notebook to write down your responses to everything, and you're your own case study to kind of do that. So once you've been competing a while, you have some data on yourself, which can actually help you. Or if you're working with a coach that knows what they're doing, they'll have some data on you, you know, on a daily basis, actually even on an hourly basis. You know, like how much did you weigh? How much did you eat? What did you eat? You're taking pictures. You're taking notes to see, you know, when your body is changing accordingly. But the second question is the calorie target. So the calorie target, really, it depends on what your goals are. And this is a great question, because if you still need to lose fat the last week, sometimes like maybe you're just not lean enough, and your show's this Saturday, and you know you're 10 days out, and you really are still not lean enough. You're probably better off trying to diet down an extra 2 pounds or 3 pounds of body fat in that week and show up a little bit leaner than trying to manipulate the body into peak week. I think you get more benefit from showing up leaner, and then maybe just trying to do some minor things the day before or 2 days before. But so in that case, I would keep myself in a calorie deficit as long as possible. Okay. And then the last day or so, do some minor adjustments and then show up. But ideally, if you're actually in shape, let's say a month out, and now you're ready, you can do some practice weeks. You're absolutely right. At that point in time, you're gonna. This is the ideal scenario. You're not really worried about necessarily eating in a caloric deficit. You're hopefully maybe eating at maintenance at that point in time. You may even need to eat a little bit extra, like you said. So you're just going to meet this goal of, I want to intake this much food. And obviously, you're not going to gain. Now, if you overeat for 4 or 5 days in a row, you can probably gain some body fat. So you wouldn't want to do that. But if you overeat for a day or 2 days, you know, let's say you overshoot by, you know, 500 or 800 calories for a couple of days, that's not going to make or break you at the end of your show. So, but typically we go at about maintenance or a little bit higher when you're kind of doing these carb up protocols.
Okay, got it. Now, what happens with dietary fiber? Because this is a little bit tricky, especially when you're carb loading, when you're manipulating carbohydrates. Obviously, you want to be very careful of how much fiber do you take, especially closer to your show day, because you don't want to be bloated or retaining, feeling discomfort, or just looking like with a big belly. So what is the fiber recommendation, especially that we already talking about carbohydrates? What type of carbohydrates are recommended for this carb loading? Just basically starchy carbohydrates, non-veggies, very little amount of veggies. What are some of these recommendations?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that's something that you definitely want to consider, because obviously the fiber can potentially hold some water in the GI tract, which is not going to look good. It can bloat you. It can, and that's a mistake I think a lot of people make, is they consume too much fiber in those last few days. Even in the carb depletion phase, you can often eat too much. I know that was a mistake I made many years ago. Is, you know, I was so hungry, and when I was carb depleting, that I would just eat a ton of vegetables, but I would eat more than I was used to the point where it gave me a lot of GI discomfort, and it would last actually well into my carb loading. When I was trying to carb load, you know, my stomach was so uncomfortable that it wasn't good. So usually the recommendation is for most people, around 10 to 15 grams of fiber is kind of about a sweet spot for most people. There's going to be some, you know, inter-individual variability there, but I'm going to say, you know, most males are going to be consuming, say, you know, 30 to 40 grams of fiber. Most females, maybe 25 to 30 leading up to the show. So you basically cut it down to, you know, at least half, I would say, maybe even a little bit more, because then the type of carbohydrate you would eat would be things more like, you know, white rice, like you said, starchy carbohydrates that don't have a lot of a lot of excessive fiber. So maybe if you're going to eat potato, maybe remove the skin. Same thing. Maybe if you're going to eat a sweet potato, maybe remove the skin itself. So that way you're minimizing some of the fiber that would be there otherwise. And of course, other types of carbohydrates work really well too. Right. This is why rice cakes can work well. I love rice on that to be able to consume that. Oatmeal sometimes has a little too much fiber, but it might be, you can maybe have a couple of meals with that way you have a little bit of the fiber, but it doesn't become excessive amounts. So I usually switch to a cream of rice, which has the carbohydrate without the fiber in there. You can do cream of wheat that often has that can work as well. And then you can also use supplements that actually have these high molecular weight type carbohydrates, like the dextrin type of products. Like the Targo is one that I like to use. Plus, it makes it easy. If you have to consume 1,000 grams of carbs, for example, trying to eat 1,000 grams of carbs of straight white rice is miserable. But if you have a Vitargo, for example, you can actually have, one scoop of that has 50 grams of carbs. So you have 2 scoops of that, that's 100 grams. And you have, let's say, 3 or 4 of those throughout the day. It's a lot easier to digest. And then now you got yourself 400 or 500 grams of carbs. Now it's a lot easier to eat another 400 or 500 grams of carbs in the form of white rice or cream of wheat or cream of rice, etc.
Okay. Wow. 1,000 grams of carb. I don't even imagine eating that amount. It's so huge. So wow. What happens with fats and protein? Like, because especially when you're carb loading, are you decreasing protein and dietary fat because they're not as needed at that point to preserve lean body mass? Or do you think you want to keep protein at a minimum, or like you don't want to decrease it too much? What happens with these two?
Yeah, that's a great question. So typically when you're doing the carb depletion early in the week, you want to keep protein on the higher side.
Yeah.
Most of the literature is going to recommend it's actually fairly significantly higher, maybe as little as 2.2 grams per kilogram, but really as high as 3.7 grams per kilogram of body weight for the protein intake during the carb depletion. And also maybe the way we recommend that, let's say for Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and then maybe even on Friday to kind of promote diuresis, keep you full, etc. Then during the carb loading, though, it's actually best to bring the protein intake down, because the priority during the carb loading is to get all those calories in it. And as you stated earlier, your facial expression said it all. Eating 1,000 grams of carbs, that's a lot of food, right?
Oh,
yeah. So imagine if you're eating, 1,000 grams of carbs, and then on top of that, you have to eat, say, 300 grams of protein. You're going to feel really full. You're going to feel really uncomfortable. And at that point in time, you're not in a caloric deficit anyway, so you're not training either. So you don't really need to maximize muscle protein synthesis at that point in time. You just need a little bit in your diet to actually help with to help with your satiety, of course, and also to help just so you can feel better and have the other macronutrients that are going to be important as you're going through there. So typically we recommend the protein intake at that point to be maybe as little as 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight on the protein side while you're carb loading. So that may be a 2 or 3 day period, and then you can bring it back up. And then the fats, same thing. One of the ways we like to do it, again, it depends on what your goals are, but you can actually start loading fats a little bit when you're carb depleting those first few days. And the theory for that is muscle is made of primarily water, but it's also glycogen. It's also the protein itself, and it's also the intramyocellular triglycerides. So those IMTs are part of the muscle. So we can actually load those, and we actually, if you're actually increasing the fat intake at that point in time, that can actually help facilitate the carbohydrate loading a little bit later. So while you're doing the carb depletion early, you can actually increase your fat intake some, and you can kind of be more on a keto type diet essentially at that point in time. So carbs are really low. Or relatively low. You don't have to be extremely low. You don't have to be below 50. So it's meant, I'm going to call it a low carb diet, not necessarily ketogenic, although ketogenic could work. But you can bring your fat intake up a little bit, proteins up a little higher for those Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Wednesday, Thursday, you kind of do the opposite. You drop the fats really low. You bring the protein fairly low, because the priority macronutrient is going to be the carbohydrate for Wednesday, Thursday. And then on Friday, you kind of do, this is where the art comes in a little bit more. You kind of mix and match to see how the body's responding. Do they need to eat? Do they need to fill out more? Do they need more carbs, less carbs? Do they need more fat, less fat? So this is where you can kind of start adjusting accordingly based on how the body is responding.
Now, you mentioned something very important. And I guess one thing I wanted to add is that I guess if you're so like, especially during the contest prep, there's a point in time that you get so hungry. I imagine like these high carb days might be either glorious or like an excessive. How does that feel? Especially maybe you have experiences. How does it feel like being able to eat so much? And I guess is it too much? And like, my God, this is a complete extreme to what I was looking for. Because it's not like highly palatable food anyways. It's like bland food, and it's not like that delicious food you want to binge on, especially when you're so hungry. So what is your perhaps more like anecdotal experience when you're eating that much, especially if you're that hungry as well and that lean?
Yeah, it's really challenging actually, and even after all the years of experience, I've had points where I know I need to eat so much, and it's really hard to get, let's say, 800 or 1,000 grams of carbs of white rice, or so it's very easy to eat other foods that you're not used to, which can work well for a little bit, but they can backfire really quick to the point where you're really uncomfortable, and then it's now you're bloated. You have gas. You're not going to be at your best. So what we really try to emphasize is to be during that period, because you're right. You're hungry, and actually the first meal of the carb loading is actually amazing, no matter what it is, just because you maybe haven't had a lot of carbs. You're already kind of you maybe haven't had that quantity of carbs for a long period of time. So the first, I would say, few meals actually feel great, but by the time Thursday or Friday come along, eating 2 cups or 3 cups of rice is no longer appealing, and it's very bland. But you have to be very disciplined. You have to stay focused, and you have to just keep your accountability to yourself and or to your coach to really help you, because it is easy to deviate. You're right. The food is not highly palatable. And it's easy to try to eat all these other foods that you haven't been used to eating. And if you do eat those in high quantities at that point in time, the risk to benefit ratio is usually not in your favor.
Manipulation of training, cardio, how much needs do you have to be paying attention to in this period of time, in this peak week? How much is enough? How much is too much? How do you kind of drop it or manipulate it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because I think sometimes, especially as bodybuilders, we think more is better, and we want to continue to push the envelope and do more cardio, do more weights, and that's really the wrong approach to take, because just like any actually competitor, if you're a world-class sprinter, a world-class marathon runner, if you're competing on that Saturday, those 7 to 10 days, your work has been done. You're really just trying to kind of peak for this particular day. So you should be tapering your training, and basically your training should just basically be to accentuate your goals, to complement your goals of what you're trying to do. So in regards to training, we can definitely start tapering cardio. If you still need to lose a little bit of extra body fat, maybe you can do a little bit more cardio on those first 3 days or so. So Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, you can still kind of keep cardio in there. But by Wednesday, when you're doing your carb loading, you should definitely really down-regulate your exercise to the point where if you're training anything, you're training very little at all, because the goal at that point is to maximize glycogen storage. So if you're burning up a lot of calories, if you're doing a lot of exercise, high intensity stuff, you're not going to be able to glycogen load very effectively. So that being said, that Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, we usually recommend the weight training to be, you don't want to push to failure or near failure. You actually want to be fairly conservative in your intensity of your training. You want relatively high volume, but not excessively high volume. You don't want to try new exercises, which is a mistake often people make. They try new exercises during that week. Now your chances of getting hurt are higher. Your chances of being sore are higher, and that's going to impact your ability to peak appropriately. You want to probably avoid excessive amounts of eccentric loading during that point in time, because it's going to make you more sore, which is going to impact your ability potentially to even carb load effectively. So you really want to do kind of tried and true exercises that work for you, that you've been doing, that are safe. Push them to the point where you definitely get a little fatigue, but not to the point of failure during those few days. Cardio, you can start tapering it down, eliminate it, or you can maybe maintain it if you still need to lose a little bit of body fat on those last few days. But Wednesday, typically what I like to do is I do my last weight training session on Wednesday. And Wednesday is typically, I'll actually train first thing in the morning. And then right after, that's when I actually begin my carb loading, right after that training session. And then that begins the process of the day. But that's the last thing that I actually do resistance training. Then what I do is I practice a little bit of posing, but cardio is eliminated typically on Wednesday and Thursday if I'm actually on the right path to do what I need to do to really peak on Saturday. And then I think, again, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you don't want to train. If anything, you just want to pose. If you train, you want to train extremely lightly. Maybe do a easy pump. That's about it. Maybe try to experiment, but you really want to keep your glycogen levels full.
Okay. Now, let's do a quick summary of what are some of the considerations and practical applications for peak week in nutrition and training. So if we had to kind of tell in a few dot points as a summary of what are your recommendations, what would that look like?
Yeah, good. So we prayed it again. We don't want to advocate that this is a cookie cutter way of doing it, because it's far from it. There are some very broad general guidelines, but just kind of give you some lanes to kind of stay in, but the lanes are fairly broad. So you can actually kind of go through there and still customize, because there's a lot of inter-individual variability in all of this. So, the first thing I want to say is, if you can't practice this about a month out, then don't try to do them all. If anything, maybe just do one variable, and the one variable that I would feel safe at doing would probably be the carbohydrate loading. Yeah. Water is one that can be very tricky, because it's one that sometimes the best thing to do with water is not do anything at all. Just keep your water intake normal. If anything, maybe just start cutting down your water, not eliminating your water, just maybe cutting down your water a little bit the evening before, and maybe the morning of, so you're not overly bloated, but you kind of want to keep water in there. If you do decide to do the water manipulation, again, it's one of those that it can work in your favor, but if you miss the mark, it can really work to your detriment. So there's a lot of coaches now that really prefer not to manipulate water at all, and I kind of respect that approach, because it is a safer road, and you kind of know what the outcome is going to be. When you play with the water, you can have a great outcome, but Scott Stevenson, my co-author, he actually says this. It's like you have a 97%, and you're trying to get 100%, so you might get 100%, but you might go down to an 89%. So that's kind of the gamble that you take. So you might be just good keeping your 97% instead of trying to get that extra little bit, because especially if you haven't practiced it, the chances of you screwing something up are very high. So the water intake is one that if you want to manipulate it, have practiced it. And again, if you do it, you want to probably avoid some of these extreme cases where, I've heard people that stop drinking water on Wednesday for a Saturday show, ridiculous stuff. Or people that take very high dosages of prescription diuretics. And I'm talking aggressive loop diuretics that deplete your sodium, deplete your potassium. Obviously, they can have cardiovascular implications. You can lose a lot of water weight for sure, but usually you end up kind of showing up flat. You can't get a pump. Your intracellular water is completely gone, and you don't look good. So those are some of the big ones that you want to avoid. The way we actually recommend it is just a natural manipulation of water, which there's a little bit of literature on it in fighters, which is basically do a little bit of water loading for a couple of days. And then you do water deplete, but you don't water cut. So in other words, let's say you're going to compete on Saturday, you would water load a couple of days beforehand. So on Friday, you actually cut your water. If you're drinking 100 milliliters per kilogram of water, say on Wednesday and Thursday, then on Friday, you actually cut down to just 15 milliliters per kilogram of body weight for water. So you're still drinking water throughout the day, and you kind of you drink most of that early in the day. And then as you get into your evening, you can start kind of, again, tapering it a little bit more. And then the morning of, just drink a little bit of water with your first meal. That way you don't feel bloated, but you still have a little bit of water in your system, and you're not dehydrated because you've been drinking water the whole time. But you haven't eliminated it, and you haven't taken a diuretic, which is the ideal scenario. Sodium, same thing. When you're drinking the water high, if you're drinking a lot of water, you're going to need to increase your sodium a little bit, because it's gonna obviously have an effect on your sodium level. So you want to have a little bit of extra sodium when you're drinking the water high during those first couple of days, and then you can start cutting the sodium down to not necessarily cutting it way under, but maybe at least the baseline as you get closer to your show. And then the carb we already talked about, the carb loading in there. We talked about the training, and then you kind of put there, and we do give general guidelines and charts in terms of how much water, and it's based on your body weight. So it's nice because it really is kind of customized for you. And of course, you need to adjust those things accordingly based on you and what's working for you. That's the most important thing, because what works for one person, it's not going to work for the other. And even what works for you today, it's not going to work for you tomorrow.
Okay, that's so good. I am so happy that we were able to discuss this paper. I think it has so much great takeaways, and people have to go and read it. I'm going to link this paper in the show notes. One last question, and I let you go. Is there anything coming up for you? Any future research? Anything that you are cooking at this point?
Yeah, I'm actually pretty excited right now. I'm working with a couple of students that were my undergraduate students, but now they're finishing up their master's degree at Cal State Fullerton. So I'm actually working on a couple of projects with them. I'm actually just overseeing some of the work that they're doing. But one of them is actually on body composition. We're going to be looking at the effects of using optimal body composition methodology, meaning following coming in fasted, not exercising, all that before body composition testing. We're going to measure them in the DEXA, the BIS, ultrasound, and we're going to also do a 4-compartment model. But they're going to come in fasted one day, then we're going to follow a particular protocol for 8 hours, test them again a little bit later, and then we're going to do the same thing 2 days later to look at the differences between what happens if we standardize what they're doing. Does that actually affect body composition? We know that it's going to affect, if you eat and drink fluid, your body composition will be a little bit different from morning to afternoon, let's say, because you've eaten, you've exercised, etc. So we're expecting that. But what happens if we do the same thing leading to that afternoon, the first day, a couple of days later? Does that actually have a change? So we're looking at that component. We're also going to be looking at another study. We're going to be looking at nutritional knowledge among Division II athletes and compare their body composition to that. So those are a couple of projects that I have going off the line. We've got a couple of new pieces of equipment. I have a new surface EMG naraxon unit that I'm getting. We just got it this summer, so I'm excited to get my hands on that and start doing some of my EMG research again. And then I am working with Chris Barakat right now as well. He's getting ready for a competition right now, so we're actually doing some documentation, a case study with him, and those are the main ones that I have right now going on. So it's pretty fun.
Are you training people?
I train a very small amount of people. I literally handpick who I work with. So right now I have 3 clients that I'm working with, and that's perfect for me. I don't like to take on too many, because I'm pretty peculiar in who I work with and what I do, and I like to give them a good experience. I'm also not very cheap, so I like to make sure that I give their money's worth to be able to do that. So yeah, I don't like to take on too many clients. That keeps my interest enough. So I have a handful of clients, but funny, actually, none of them are actually competitors right now. One's actually a marathon runner, and one is another person just getting ready for. She just wants to get in shape. So it's a couple different paths of life there that we're working with.
That's awesome. Where people can get to find your research, all the things you do, and you post as well in your social media.
My social media is at Dr. GFit. So you can find me on at Dr. GFit. It's all spelled out. And you can also find me through my university at California State University, San Bernardino. So you can put my name, Guillermo Escalante, CSUSB, and you can find me there. Oh, I didn't mention who my third client was. It's my son, Daniel. He is a competitor. He's getting ready for a classic physique show coming up. So I'm excited. I'm working with him as well.
Okay, that's awesome. Well, Guillermo, I enjoy so much our conversation, and to see you again. It's really good every time I see you.
That sounds good. Thanks for having me again. I keep up all the good work. I appreciate all the educational content you provide to your audience and to other people. It's really good content that's very relevant, and I really appreciate all the education that you put forward. Thank you for all that.
Thank you so much to you, and I hope to see you very soon.
Likewise. Take care, Astrid.